The sun hung high above the city square, casting its warm light over the busy streets. People bustled around, going about their daily lives, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. In the midst of the chaos, a man stumbled through the crowd, his steps unsteady as he navigated through the throngs of people. His hair was unkempt, his eyes a little glazed over, and his movements were slow. He had clearly been indulging in some form of mind-altering relaxation, and now the world around him seemed both amusing and confusing. The man, a stranger to the city, had wandered in from a nearby alley where he had been passing time, enjoying his own company and the freedom of a less organized world. With a cigarette dangling loosely from his lips, he grinned to himself, unaware of the path he was walking down. Everything seemed to slow down for him as his senses blurred. The sound of the marketplace mixed with the noise of distant conversations, forming a strange, harmonious hum in his mind. As he walked, he noticed something unusual. Ahead, a group of highly disciplined soldiers stood, dressed in sharp uniforms, and moving with the quiet precision of those who had seen many years of service. They were the Royal Guard, and they had come to escort a member of the royal family through the city. It was not an uncommon sight, but today, something about it caught the man's attention. Maybe it was the way they stood, unshaken by the movement around them, or perhaps it was the stoic expressions that seemed carved from stone. The man squinted as he looked at one guard in particular, who stood tall at the front of the procession. His eyes were locked straight ahead, his face unreadable, and his posture straight and unmoving, almost as if he were part of the stone monument that towered nearby. It was the perfect moment to have a little fun, the man thought. What harm could a small prank do? After all, he felt no pressure, no concern for the consequences of his actions. He had never been one to think about those things when the world seemed so far away. Without giving it much thought, the man pulled the cigarette from his mouth, flicked the tip slightly to send a few embers flying, and then, in a swift motion, aimed it directly at the Royal Guard's pristine uniform. The ember flew through the air and landed on the guard's coat. There was a brief moment where time seemed to stop as the crowd watched in suspended silence. The cigarette smoldered against the fabric, leaving a small singed mark, a tiny symbol of the man's defiance. For a split second, the crowd held their breath, waiting for the guard to react. Surely the soldier would respond, wouldn't he? But to everyone's surprise, the Royal Guard did nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the burn on his coat. His stoic face remained unchanged, his eyes still focused straight ahead, as if he had seen worse and simply wasn't moved by the childish act. The man stood there for a moment, watching the guard, expecting something, anything. But when nothing happened, the man's lips curled into a grin. He couldn't help it. He thought it was hilarious. Here he was, a man out of his mind on the streets, and he had just burned the uniform of a royal guard without facing any consequences. What a joke. The crowd around him began to murmur in disbelief. Some of them seemed impressed, others uneasy. A few whispered to one another, wondering what the guard would do next, but no one seemed willing to challenge the situation directly. The man, still chuckling to himself, continued walking, oblivious to the quiet tension building in the air around him. Little did he know, he had just set in motion a chain of events that would soon turn this seemingly trivial moment into something far more serious. The man continued walking, his laughter still lingering in the air as he moved deeper into the crowd. He felt a strange sense of pride, as if he had accomplished something great. After all, how many people could say they had done something that made a royal guard look like a fool? He didn't even feel the need to look back. The moment was already fading for him, replaced by a new distraction. His eyes wandered across the busy square, searching for his next amusement. But as he walked, he began to notice something unusual. The crowd had quieted down. People were no longer chatting or laughing. Instead, they were looking at the royal guard, many of them with anxious expressions, as though waiting for something to happen. It made the man's grin fade just slightly. Was there something he had missed? He glanced back, his mind slow from the haze of his high, but there was no immediate reaction from the guard. The soldier still stood there, unmoved by the burn on his uniform. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face as impassive as ever. Yet, even though the guard appeared calm, there was something in the air. A tension, a kind of stillness that suggested the calmness might be deceiving. The man felt an odd chill run through him. Still, he dismissed the feeling, chalking it up to nothing more than his altered state of mind. After all, who could blame him for having a little fun? The day was warm, the crowd was lively, and he was in no mood for anything serious. But as he walked further away, he began to notice that the whispers in the crowd were growing louder. There was a slight change in the atmosphere, a shift that he couldn't quite place. People were now talking more openly, their voices filled with curiosity or concern. Some were even pointing toward the royal guard, their faces filled with disbelief, as if they couldn't believe what had just happened. The man felt a growing unease in the pit of his stomach. For a moment, he considered turning around to see if the guard had done anything at all. But he quickly shrugged off the thought. He wasn't afraid. Why should he be? Then, without warning, he heard footsteps approaching from behind him. They were steady, deliberate, and growing louder. The man, still lost in his own world, turned his head just in time to see two more guards, both imposing figures, begin to walk toward him through the crowd. They were moving with purpose, their eyes scanning the area. The man felt a cold rush of realization. Maybe this wasn't as funny as he had thought. He felt his heartbeat quicken, but he brushed the feeling aside, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Still, the guards drew closer, and the man couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had crossed a line. He hadn't been thinking when he flicked the cigarette at the royal guard, and now the consequences of his reckless actions seemed to be catching up with him. He slowed his pace, looking around for a way out of the situation, but the street was packed with people on all sides. He was trapped in the middle of the square, and it was impossible to escape without drawing attention. One of the guards stepped in front of him, their expression unreadable. The man's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment. He had no idea what the guards would do, but he couldn't deny the growing anxiety creeping into his chest. The small, silly action that had started as a joke was now spiraling into something he couldn't control. The guard who had been hit with the cigarette was still at the front of the procession, watching silently, his stance unwavering. The man wanted to apologize, to say something to smooth over the situation, but the words caught in his throat. The guard stood there, waiting, as if giving him a moment to realize the gravity of his actions. The laughter he had felt earlier seemed distant now, replaced by the uncomfortable weight of the moment. The air grew heavier as the two guards stood before the man, their silence more threatening than any harsh words could have been. The once lively square, filled with the hum of conversation and the sounds of merchants calling out to customers, now felt strangely still. It was as if time itself had paused, waiting for something to happen. The man's mind, still clouded by the haze of his earlier indulgence, struggled to make sense of the situation. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, and the buzzing in his head was no longer the peaceful hum it had been earlier. As the guard stood in front of him, the man tried to maintain his calm, but his eyes flickered nervously from one to the other. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle any situation, someone who could get out of trouble with just a joke or a clever comment. But now, with the royal guards blocking his path and the crowd watching in anticipation, his usual bravado seemed to have evaporated. The two guards exchanged a brief glance, one that lasted only a second but spoke volumes. There was no anger in their eyes, but something else, something cold and calculated. It was as if they had already decided what to do, and now they were simply waiting for the right moment. The man swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. He wasn't in control of this situation. He had crossed a line, and he had no idea what the consequences would be. Around him, the crowd's whispers had faded into a tense silence. The onlookers were no longer murmuring in amusement or disbelief. They were watching with rapt attention, some with a look of quiet concern, others with expressions that seemed to ask, "What happens next?" The man's eyes darted around, but there was nowhere to hide. The guards were too close, and the space around him felt suffocating. He felt a pang of regret, but it was too late for that now. The joke he had thought was harmless was slowly turning into something much more serious, and he couldn't undo it. He had mocked the royal guard, and now it seemed as though he would have to face the consequences. His mind raced for something to say, a clever remark to diffuse the situation, but nothing came to mind. The only sound he could hear now was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. One of the guards stepped forward, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the cobblestones. The man instinctively took a step back, but he couldn't escape. The guard's presence was overwhelming, a reminder of the power and discipline that came with serving the royal family. The man's throat went dry as he looked up, trying to gauge the guard's next move. Would they arrest him? Would they ignore what had happened and let him go? He couldn't tell, but he was starting to feel a little less certain of his earlier confidence. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of the royal guard who had been the target of his prank. The man's gaze was unwavering, and although his face remained expressionless, there was something about his posture that spoke volumes. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet authority in the way he stood. The man felt a sudden rush of embarrassment. He had thought the guard would laugh it off, or maybe just ignore the small burn. But now, in the face of the royal guards, the weight of his actions began to sink in. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, and his thoughts became more fragmented. His high was wearing off, leaving only the heavy feeling of realization. The joke, the moment of amusement, had turned into something far more serious than he had anticipated. He was no longer sure how to handle it, or what the next step should be. All he knew was that the royal guards weren't amused, and the crowd was waiting for a resolution. The man's hands, which had once been steady, now trembled slightly. He wanted to apologize, but the words felt stuck in his throat. The guards were still watching him, their expressions unreadable, but the silence between them seemed to speak volumes. The man felt the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever happened next, he couldn't undo what he had done. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing second. The man's palms were beginning to sweat, and his stomach twisted in knots as he stood facing the guards. The once light-hearted atmosphere had evaporated, leaving behind only the heavy weight of his mistake. The guards had not moved or said a word, but their presence was enough to make him feel like he was trapped in a corner, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. The crowd, still silent, seemed to be holding its collective breath, waiting for something to happen. The man tried to focus, his mind racing as he searched for a way out of the situation. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no easy way out. He had crossed a line by mocking a royal guard, and now the guards were here, standing before him, with no sign of mercy. The man felt a surge of regret, but it was quickly drowned out by the anxiety gnawing at him. He had been foolish, and now it seemed like he would pay the price for it. One of the guards finally moved, stepping closer to the man. The sound of his boots on the cobblestones echoed in the stillness, and the man instinctively took another step back. His heart raced, and his breath became shallow as he tried to read the guard's expression. But the guard's face remained as impassive as ever, his eyes focused on the man with an unwavering intensity that made him feel small and insignificant. The other guard stood at a distance, watching silently, but his posture was just as rigid and imposing. It was clear that the man was not going to get away with his actions. The man swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and he realized that he had no idea what to expect next. Would they arrest him? Would they escort him away in front of the entire crowd? He had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty only made him feel more vulnerable. For a moment, the silence stretched on, with nothing but the sound of the man's racing heartbeat and the soft rustling of the crowd in the background. The man shifted uneasily, trying to think of something to say, but the words wouldn't come. His usual wit and confidence were nowhere to be found. He felt like a child caught doing something wrong, but the severity of the situation was enough to make him realize that he wasn't dealing with a simple reprimand. This was something much bigger. The guard who had moved closer to him finally spoke, his voice calm and even, but with an undeniable authority that made the man freeze in place. The words were soft, yet firm, and the man could feel the weight of them hanging in the air. "You've caused a disturbance," the guard said, his gaze unwavering, "and that is not something we take lightly." The man felt a chill run down his spine as the reality of the situation settled in. The guard's voice, though calm, carried a message of seriousness that couldn't be ignored. The man's heart skipped a beat as he realized that he wasn't just dealing with a moment of embarrassment. This could be much worse. The guard continued, his tone never rising, but carrying a quiet power that made the man feel like he was being sized up. "We do not tolerate disrespect to the royal family or their soldiers," the guard added. The man's stomach churned as the weight of the guard's words sank in. He had thought it was just a harmless joke, but now he saw how wrong he had been. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but no words came. The fear that had been slowly creeping up on him now consumed him entirely. The crowd remained silent, and all he could hear was the guard's voice, steady and unyielding. The man wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, but the guards were too close. There was no escape. He had put himself in this situation, and now he would have to face whatever consequences awaited him. The man stood frozen, his mind racing as the guard's words echoed in his ears. The calm, steady voice of the soldier had left no room for argument. He couldn't escape it now. He had done something foolish, something that had caught the attention of the royal guards, and now it felt like he was trapped in a situation he could neither understand nor control. The air felt thick with the weight of expectation, and every passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last. The man's breath quickened, and his throat was dry. His thoughts jumbled together, trying to form some kind of apology, but nothing seemed to come out right. He felt exposed, like every pair of eyes in the crowd was trained on him, watching as the consequences of his actions were about to unfold. The first guard, the one who had stepped closer to him, shifted slightly. His posture was still perfect, straight, unyielding, but now there was something in the way he looked at the man that made him feel even smaller. There was no anger in the guard's eyes, just a quiet, steely resolve. The man had seen that look before, when soldiers were faced with a decision that was already made. There was no room for negotiation, no room for mercy. What was done, and the man had no choice but to face the outcome. Just as the man thought he might say something, anything to make this better, a soft, almost inaudible sound broke through the tense silence. It was the sound of fabric rustling, and the man's attention snapped to the second guard, the one who had been standing at a distance. The guard reached down to his belt, his movements smooth and precise. The man's heart skipped a beat. What was the guard doing? What was coming next? Before he could react, the second guard pulled something from his side. A small vial, almost delicate in its appearance. The man squinted, trying to make sense of what was happening. The vial was no larger than his palm, and it seemed entirely harmless. But in this moment, every little movement felt monumental. The guard uncorked the vial, releasing a soft puff of mist into the air. For a brief moment, the man stood there, unsure of what to do or say. His brain, clouded by his earlier state, struggled to make sense of the situation. He had expected the guards to be angry, to drag him away or shout at him. But this was different. The guards' actions were deliberate, controlled, and far too calm for the man to fully comprehend. It wasn't until he felt the first tingling sensation at the back of his throat that he realized what was happening. The mist from the vial had a strange, faintly sweet scent, and it quickly filled the air between them. The man inhaled without thinking, too distracted by the sudden turn of events to realize what he was doing. His head immediately began to spin. The tingling sensation spread throughout his body, and within moments, the fog in his mind deepened. What had once felt like a mild buzz now felt overwhelming, like the world around him was slowly slipping away. His legs grew heavy, and his thoughts became disjointed. The crowd around him seemed to blur, their faces melting into a haze of indistinguishable shapes. He tried to focus, tried to shake off the strange sensation, but it was as if his own body was no longer responding the way it should. The weight of the mist settled deeper into his chest, and his eyelids grew heavy. The man's vision started to waver. He could still hear the soft murmur of the crowd, the faint echo of footsteps, but everything sounded muffled, as if he were underwater. The last thing he remembered was the guard's steady gaze, unwavering, and the realization that his joke had now brought him to this point. He had thought it would be harmless fun, a quick laugh at the expense of the royal guard. But now, faced with the consequences, the man could only feel a deep sense of confusion, mixed with an overwhelming desire to rest. Before he could even take another step, his knees buckled, and his body collapsed to the ground. His vision blurred completely, and the world around him faded into nothingness. The man's body hit the ground with a soft thud, his limbs limp and unresponsive. For a moment, everything was silent. The busy square, the crowd, the royal guards, everything seemed to stop moving. His mind, now engulfed in a haze, struggled to grasp what had just happened. The sweet, heavy mist still clung to his senses, and he felt as if he were floating, distant from everything around him. The guards stood silently, watching as the man lay unconscious at their feet. The second guard, who had used the vial of mist, glanced briefly at his companion. There was no need for words. Both knew exactly what had been done. The man, foolish and unaware, had caused a disturbance, and now he would sleep off his reckless behavior, his actions meeting with the swift, controlled response of the guards. Around them, the crowd murmured softly, unsure of what had just transpired. Some of the onlookers looked concerned, while others seemed to watch with a quiet curiosity. They had all witnessed the man's prank, and now they were seeing the consequences unfold before them. It was a strange, almost surreal moment. The square, which had once been lively and filled with voices, was now hushed, as if everyone in the crowd could feel the weight of the situation. As the man lay unconscious, the royal guards moved with practiced precision. One of them stepped forward, his boots making a firm, steady sound on the cobblestones as he knelt down beside the man. He checked for signs of life, pressing 2 fingers gently against the man's wrist. His pulse was steady, though slow from the effects of the mist. The guard nodded, confirming that the man was merely asleep, deeply entranced by the calming powder. The second guard, still standing at a distance, watched the proceedings without a word. His gaze remained focused, and his posture was as rigid as ever. The crowd continued to observe, but none dared to move too close. The tension had shifted. What had once seemed like a trivial incident was now unfolding into something more serious. The guards were not reacting with anger, but with the quiet authority that came with their position. They had dealt with disruptions before, and they would handle this one as efficiently as they always did. As the man continued to lie on the ground, some of the people in the crowd began to drift away. They had seen enough. The square was slowly returning to normal, the events of the past few minutes fading into the background as the royal procession resumed its course. The royal family, unaware of the prank that had just taken place, continued forward, their presence still commanding attention, though the excitement had dimmed. The guards, having ensured that the man was safe and secure, stood up and exchanged a few words, their voices quiet and measured. They had seen this kind of thing before, people who acted out of turn, who felt the need to challenge authority for the sake of amusement or bravado. But these guards were professionals, and their training had prepared them for moments like this. There was no need for drama or loud punishment. Instead, they acted with a calm efficiency, handling the situation in the way they had been taught. The man, still unconscious and unaware of the events unfolding around him, would soon wake up to find himself in a completely different situation than he had imagined. What had started as a careless joke had turned into a reminder of the consequences of his actions. His mind, still fogged from the mist, had no idea what he would face when he came to. But for now, he was asleep, and the world around him continued on. As the crowd began to disperse, the last few onlookers made their way out of the square. The royal guards remained standing, ever vigilant, their task for the moment completed. The incident, though small in the grand scheme of things, had served as a reminder to those who had witnessed it, that sometimes actions had consequences, and those consequences were not always immediately clear. The man had learned a lesson, whether he realized it or not. The man slowly came to, his eyelids fluttering as he woke from a deep, disorienting sleep. His head felt heavy, his body sluggish, and his senses were muddled. For a few moments, everything was a blur. His surroundings, the sounds, even his thoughts seemed distant, like a dream he couldn't fully recall. He tried to move, but his limbs felt strangely heavy, as if they were made of stone. The air around him smelled faintly of something sweet, and there was a dryness in his throat that made him cough lightly. He blinked, struggling to make sense of his situation. The square was empty now, and the once bustling crowd had disappeared, leaving behind only the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. He was lying on the ground, his back pressed against cold, unforgiving stone. Slowly, he managed to lift his head, his eyes scanning the area around him. He was no longer in the thick of the crowd. Instead, he found himself lying in a quieter part of the square, just off to the side where he had first been standing. The royal guards were gone, and the royal procession had continued its way through the city. There was no sign of the imposing figures who had confronted him earlier. The man's memory began to return, and with it came the sharp reminder of the prank he had pulled. The cigarette, the burn, the laughter, and then the guard's calm response, followed by the strange mist and the overwhelming fog that had taken over his mind. His stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. He had been out cold, and from the looks of it, the guards had ensured he wasn't in any immediate danger. But the confusion he felt was only growing. What had they done to him? Why had they reacted the way they did? The man tried to sit up, pushing himself off the ground with unsteady arms. The dizziness returned in full force, and he had to steady himself by leaning against a nearby column for support. He couldn't remember how long he had been out, but the events felt like they had happened only moments ago. As his mind slowly cleared, a heavy sense of embarrassment began to wash over him. What had started as a joke, a careless, thoughtless prank, had ended in something far more serious. The weight of his actions, and the way they had been met with such a controlled, methodical response, settled on him like a stone in his chest. The man glanced around, his eyes searching for signs of anyone who might have seen what had happened. But there was no one around now, just a few scattered people who were going about their business, unaware of the brief chaos that had unfolded earlier. The square, once full of life and energy, now seemed calm, almost indifferent to his presence. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering effects of the mist. His head still ached, and his body felt like it had been drained of energy. It was as if the fog had not only clouded his mind, but had also sapped him of his strength. He realized that he had been lucky that the guards had not been more forceful, that the situation had not escalated further. He had made a fool of himself, and yet, somehow, he had gotten off with nothing more than a strange, deep sleep. The realization hit him like a wave. His careless actions had consequences, but they hadn't been immediate or obvious. He had expected some kind of loud reaction, maybe an angry confrontation, or even punishment. But instead, he had been put to sleep, left to face the uncomfortable truth of what he had done when he woke up. It was a strange kind of lesson, one that wasn't as simple as the consequences he had imagined. The man stood up, still feeling a bit unsteady, but his legs were stronger now. He looked around the square one last time, taking in the peaceful scene that contrasted so sharply with the chaos in his mind. The royal guards were long gone, and the city had returned to its usual rhythm. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He took a slow step forward, then another, and began to walk away. His pace was steady, but his thoughts were still swirling. He had learned something important today, not just about the guards, but about himself. And as he moved through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before he truly understood the weight of that lesson. The man walked through the streets, his mind still processing everything that had happened. The square, once filled with the hustle and bustle of life, now seemed so distant, like a memory that faded as quickly as it was made. His footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone roads as he made his way further away from the scene. He had expected to feel angry or embarrassed, but instead there was a quiet realization settling deep inside him. He had been foolish, yes, but there was something more he had learned from the whole experience. The city around him was alive, but it felt distant now. His surroundings, the faces of strangers, the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, all of it seemed less important compared to the stillness in his mind. It was as though he had stepped into a world of clarity, where his actions had been laid bare before him. He had thought his prank was harmless, a small joke, a silly moment of amusement, but now he saw it differently. The way the guard had stood still, unwavering, like a statue in the face of his provocation. The calm control in their actions, everything that had seemed so funny at the time now appeared as a reminder of his lack of respect. He found a bench along a quieter street, tucked between two small shops. Without thinking much, he sat down, his body still feeling the aftereffects of the mist. The world around him seemed so much quieter now, the sounds of the city muffled as his thoughts raced. He had been reckless, yes, but he had also been given a moment of insight that he couldn't ignore. He had learned a hard lesson today, one that wasn't about facing immediate punishment or feeling ashamed. No, this lesson was more profound. It was about the consequences of actions, how even a small thing could ripple outward in ways that weren't immediately clear. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a half-burned cigarette, the same one he had used earlier in the square. He stared at it for a moment, the small ember glowing faintly at the end, but he made no move to light it. Instead, he dropped it into a nearby ashtray, watching as it went out with a soft hiss. The gesture felt symbolic. He had once used the cigarette in a way that brought harm to someone, even if it was unintentional. And now he was putting it out, leaving behind the reckless part of himself that had thoughtlessly caused trouble. As he sat there, he couldn't help but think about the royal guard. The calmness in the guard's demeanor had left an impression on him. The man had expected anger, an immediate show of force, but instead, he had been met with controlled silence. It was a powerful lesson. The guard's actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. It was a reminder that sometimes it wasn't the loudest reactions that mattered, but the quiet strength that came from knowing when to act and when to remain still. The man sighed softly, feeling the weight of the moment. He had learned a lot today, but he knew that understanding this lesson wasn't enough. It wasn't just about recognizing his mistake. It was about changing his perspective, learning to move through the world with more awareness and respect for the people around him. As he stood up from the bench, he felt a new sense of clarity, a kind of quiet resolve. The crowd and the noise of the city no longer felt as important as they had before. He had gained something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of the way his actions affected the world around him. The royal guards had shown him that there was power in composure, in responding to chaos with calm, and in understanding that sometimes the consequences of our actions are not immediate, but they are always inevitable. The man took a deep breath, his steps steady now, and as he walked away from the quiet bench, he knew that he would carry this lesson with him. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble, it was about understanding that every action, no matter how small, had its ripples. And sometimes, The quietest actions had the biggest impact.